Can we just start in prayer? Dear Lord, may the words of my lips and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight. Amen. We've just heard two very different Bible passages. Thank you very much, Martin. That was quite a marathon, wasn't it? But they both have some key things in common. They illustrate how God speaks, and that's our theme today. In the Joel reading, we have Joel prophesying. He prophesies against a backdrop of catastrophe that's taking place in Israel. Their crops are being devastated by a plague of locusts. And Joel uses this occasion to expose to the Israelites that they have become complacent. As Eugene Peterson puts it, they are continuing life with an overlay of routine, self-preoccupation, and the manner of business as usual. So Joel is reminding them that actually there isn't a day that goes by when they are not dealing with God. We are always dealing with God. And he goes on to prophesy or promise that before the day of judgment, every kind of people will prophesy, and whoever calls God for help will be rescued. So in these times, Joel tells us to expect God's Spirit to be poured out, sons and daughters to start prophesying, old men to have dreams, and young men to have visions. In other words, we will hear from God and be compelled to tell everyone around us. In the other passage, we see God working in the early church, bringing momentous change. God is breaking down barriers. The gospel is for the Gentiles, not just the Jewish nation. We hear about Cornelius, a Roman centurion, a devout man of God who prays constantly. He has a vision. Not just any vision, but an angel of the Lord talks to him. He's told that his prayers are heard and instructs him to send men to Joppa, and he's given detailed instructions. And then we hear about Peter. Well, we know about Peter, a close friend of Jesus, and now he's actively proclaiming the gospel to the Jews. Peter is hungry. He falls into a trance. He has a strange vision and hears a voice. And Peter is left puzzled. But then the Spirit speaks to him, tells him about the 3 men about to arrive, and pieces of a jigsaw puzzle for Peter start to fall into place. God has communicated him a huge change in his theological thinking. God is for everyone. So does God speak to us in the same way today? Do we have prophets today, like Joel? Well, do you know what? I would suggest we do. We have some amazing theologians who are taking our thinking much further than those where most of our grandparents were thinking and where their thinking stood. Oddly, these modern theologians go way back into the early church, they research, but they also explore new areas against our own cultures today. There's Henri Nouwen, Thomas Merton, Steve Chalke, Paula Gooder, Richard Raw. Those are a few that I'm aware of. Now, I don't always agree with everything they say, and I'm quite sure that you don't either. But they stretch our thinking, and they make us think about God, about church, about who we are, and about our purposes in very different and sometimes very uncomfortable ways. Are they modern-day prophets? Is God's Spirit poured out today? Well, I believe it is. Have you experienced Spirit-filled times when you're in a cathedral service or in Christchurch service, a prayer group, a home group? Sometimes, occasionally, it really feels strongly that the Spirit is moving within the group, moving, leading, questioning, demanding. Or the meeting that seemed really ordinary, but words from it that afterwards keep coming back to you, keep nudging you, keep haunting you and challenging you. Perhaps you feel the same. Are sons and daughters prophesying? Well, I've already mentioned the theologians, but what about you? Have you felt compelled to say something to someone at church? Are you compelled sometimes to say what you think that God is asking you or someone else to do? I think that some of the testimonies that we've heard in church recently, yes, our ordinary, normal, well, you could call them normal congregation, have shared things when they've been compelled. And dreams? At our team prayer meetings, we've recently shared when someone's believed that they've had a dream that has something important to say. I'm sorry to say I don't dream much and I don't get any messages that way at all. But I love it when someone else shares theirs and it feels pertinent to the group. And visions. Well, now I can speak from experience here. I have had a vision, which I shared when I went to the Bishop Advisory Council. That's before you start your ordination training. I sort of almost hoped that when I shared it to them, that they would think I was so mad, they'd say, no, you're not suitable for ordination, and that would be the end of that walk. Unfortunately, though, or fortunately, actually, they actually took it really seriously. And then, when I started sharing that vision with others, I've been struck in wonderment about visions that other people have had. I think sometimes we need to be brave and open that door for others to feel comfortable to share by sharing ourselves. There are probably more people around us having visions than we would imagine. So I don't think there's much doubt that God speaks to us in the same way today. However, we don't tend to think of God speaking to us so dramatically, and I wonder why. Do we play it down? Do we not expect to hear God speak? I think that we've become very good at blocking God out and conditioning ourselves not to hear from God. Let me explain. At the grand old age of 36, I went to university. And I studied theology alongside a teacher training qualification. At the end of the 4th year, there's that mammoth final piece of work that has to go in, and it had to be action research and involve theology and education. Well, I'd had a theory, and I thought that this might be the time to test this theory out. The more that I'd become involved with children, the more I'd thought that children seemed to be very open to God and sometimes very deeply connected to God. I'd experienced children saying some really strange and deep things after their collective worship or their assemblies, and I just thought, are they really tuned in to God? So I started to look for a vehicle to do this research. I didn't want to ask leading questions, and the children I most wanted to hear from couldn't write necessarily. I came across a really good research technique called Draw and Write, and I composed my questionnaire and then worked with 150 primary-age children in a Church of England school, asking them questions about their assemblies. The results of the research, I thought, were really exciting. The key result that stood out to me was that 43% of children were able to answer the Draw and Write question about meeting God in an assembly positively. They encountered God in their collective worship. Now, that would probably not surprise some theologians that focus on children's experiences of God. John Hull, for example, argues that children are not given enough credit for their ability to have a religious experience or understanding. My research then took me a bit further. The Hardy Institute, which is a theological research establishment, suggests that children have religious experiences which are dismissed and put down by adults. Subsequently, they're effectively making the religious experience not of worth, valueless, which leads to the child then dismissing the experiences themselves, negating their worth, and eventually not noticing the experiencing. I think we kill it. I concluded that we need to allow children to express their religious feelings, give permission for experiences, validate them, take them really seriously, and move on them. So I uncovered in my research that other researchers had recognized that we were putting down children's special experiences from, oh, she's only talking to her imaginary friend again, to there's no such thing as angels. We can actually make it embarrassing for them to talk about it. Do we do that as adults, I wonder? Is this the landscape that Joel was prophesying in, where we continue life with an overlay of routine, self-preoccupation, and a manner of business as usual, where mundane becomes the norm and we don't even notice the holy? I don't share my experiences widely. I ensure that I'm on safe ground. Yes, I do not want to be belittled and laughed at. Interestingly, I think I was really blessed that when I had this vision, I went home and told my husband all about it. Years on from it now, I'm sure that if I hadn't done that, I would have disregarded it as a figment of my imagination. The point I want to make here is that we may be the biggest block to God. We actually need to recondition ourselves. We may need to broaden our belief that we can hear words, we can see visions and expect them. I'm reminded of Jan's talk last week. How often do we start our prayers with, God, I believe that you love me and want to talk to me. Speak, your servant is listening. And then wait expectantly. Another of my favourite theologians is Barbara Brown Taylor. She has the ability to be really down to earth and clarify things well. She gave a talk a while ago on misconceptions about the people that hear God's voice. And I think her points are useful for us today. She starts by saying that anyone who hears the voice of God may not be able to describe it and live it. Do not think that people will be able to explain the experience clearly and effectively and wisely. You might think that someone who hears God should be someone who has a defined sense of where God is leading them in life, someone who knows how to keep their focus, and someone who then does not stray from their purpose. And Barbara Brown Taylor asks us, perhaps you are pretty sure that you haven't heard God's voice because you lack that persistent sense of purpose. Do you think that anyone who hears God's voice is always and consistently connected to God? That they have a set of spiritual practices that they stick to all the time? That they read the Bible daily and that they never miss church? That they have a friend or a spouse or a small group whom they can talk to about their experiences and the conversations are always great? That these people know how to pray, and the evidence of that is that God talks back to them. And again, Barbara Brown Taylor challenges. Are you pretty sure that you haven't quite heard God's voice because you know that other people have spiritual lives like that and you do not? Her third challenge or misconception is that people who hear the voice of God can always hear it in worship. The scriptures and sermons and songs always connect with something in their experience. They believe everything we say in the prayers and the statements of faith. They never get bored in worship and beyond worship. They have great relationships with all the other people at church. Church is never frustrating. It's never hard for them to get up on a Sunday and go, and they never tire of the service. And once more, Barbara Brown Taylor challenges. Do you know that you're not really hearing the voice of God because church has never been quite perfect for you? She really is so honest. I find it so helpful to recognize and admit with her that I am human, I make mistakes, I'm not perfect, and neither were so many of the people whom God talks to in the Old and New Testament. She tells us to put these misconceptions aside and says, the reality is The way true believers believe is the way most of us believe, valiantly on some days and pitifully on others. Faith is a challenge for all of us, and none of us enjoys it without struggles and failures along the way. And God is still there for us all, not just for those perfectly godly people outlined above, but for you, us. Of course, that doesn't stop you wanting to hear God's voice more clearly. We would like to know more clearly how to listen to the voice of God in our lives. Just let me remind you of Jan's props last week. She brought up the Bible, the journal, reference books, and the worship service itself. And then something that resonated so much with me. Thank you, Jan. My husband, Mark, and I had been enjoying one of the grandchildren, babbling and gurgling away happily. It had made us smile and rejoice. Jan really shed a spotlight on that for us. Our babies joyously praise, and it infects us. So don't think you wouldn't hear God speak in those unexpected places, through children, babies, teenagers, strangers, and vulnerable adults. Then there is, of course, meditation and contemplation. In our Acts reading, it really struck me that Peter was hungry when he fell into the trance. I know that many people here actually fast, and fasting can be a really good spiritual discipline to help you hear God's voice and enable more effective prayer and contemplation, but that it isn't appropriate for everyone. A focus on contemplation would actually make up a whole new sermon series and definitely take us years of practice. But I do think it's worth saying here that those that practice contemplation often report that they encounter with God at the depths of their own being. I wonder if that's a shade too close to hearing God in our imaginations. But actually, Richard Rohr argues that we should even consider hearing God in our own imagination. This is a quote from him. If the incarnation is true, then of course God speaks to us through our own thoughts. When accusers called Joan of Arc in the 1400s the victim of her own imagination, she is frequently credited with this brilliant reply: "How else would God speak to me?" So today, I hope that I've provoked your thinking and opened some doors to be open to hearing from God, to expect to hear from God, to not rule out those pictures and dreams and visions and voices as being from God, and to dare to share them with others. But how can we be sure that what we hear or see or feel or dream is from God? Well, that is a vital question, and it's a really appropriate check on everything that I have said today. So next week, we'll be spending time on discerning whether what we hear is from God or not. Amen.